The Missing Witches Project is entirely listener supported, and listener, we want you to join us. Do you want to be part of a community that helps make public research into marginalized ideas? Do you want to join in interviews with all these magical people and meet other anti-racist, trans-inclusive, neuroqueer, feminist practitioners of different kinds from all over the world in our monthly circles? Or are you maybe just down to send a little money magic towards these stories and ideas and the causes we support? Anyway, either way, check out missingwitches.com to learn more about us. And please know, we've been missing you. And one last thing before we start. The stories we tell require a general content warning. It's just a fact of this terrain of interrogating what is missing. We promise to hold those moments with care.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
I wanted to end Season 7 of the Missing Witches podcast, keeping a promise I made in Season 6 when telling the story of Genesis P. Orridge, and invite you to join me now to give Cosey, Fanni, Tutti her due. Amplified. Cosey Fanni Tutti, born Christine Carol Newby, was a regular girl, raised in a port town in the post-war drudgery and PTSD hangover of England 1951, who would go on to become irregular and shape the way I think about art, sex, music, and the occult. Christine eventually became Cosey, short for cosmosis, a portmanteau of cosmos and osmosis, a gradual absorption of the whole of the universe. She added the Fanni Tutti when the surname was suggested to her by a friend, male artist Robin Klasnick, based on the title of the opera Così fan tutti, meaning literally, that's all women do, or all women are the same. Please note that while in America, a fanny refers to a bum, a bottom, a butt, in the UK, fanny means vagina. So, if we take a moment to break it down, her name becomes cosmos, osmosis, vagina, everything. Which somehow, strangely, makes perfect sense. In her lifetime, she has released into the world countless actions, performance and visual art pieces, and sensory installations, as well as over 50 albums of music. As one fan wrote, Cosey Fanni Tutti helped permanently alter modern musical consciousness with sonic and visual transgressions rooted in electronic experimentation and socio-political confrontation. Throbbing Gristle disturbed the music business not only because their music was spawned from a cauldron of coal-stained industry and ritualistic explorations, but also because TG proved, in the days before indie became a genre rather than a descriptor, that an artist could thrive and produce outside of the music business proper by creating their own label, Industrial Records, and controlling their own releases. In our Genesis P. Orridge episode, I couldn't figure out why Jen was so dismissive of Cosey in their own memoir, Non-Binary. Having since read Cosey's autobiography, Art, Sex, Music, which came out 3 years before Jen's, now I know why. Cosey's pretty candid about Jen's outbursts, tantrums, violence, and manipulations. I'm guessing Jen wasn't willing or able to deny Cosey's side of the story, and so they just left it out. Left Cosey out of their story as much as they could. That's something we've struggled with from time to time with this Missing Witches project. Falling in love only to have the research render the object of our affection credibly problematized. We ruminate on what to put in, how much to leave out, and we made a decision early on to keep honesty as part of our legacy. To leave in the imperfect bits as homage to our own imperfections. To sacrifice comfort and ease for the sake of wholeness because, as Cosey puts it, the beauty is in the whole package. What have you sacrificed, my dear, sweet witches, in your story What have you sacrificed in order to be yourself? To live authentically, imperfectly, and allow those you love to do the same? What have you sacrificed? What have you left out? Cosey's motto is, "My life is my art is my life," and so it had to be. After her infamous exhibition Prostitution opened in London in 1976 and made headlines, her mother never spoke to her again. Her father had already disowned her years prior for being a teenage rebel, wearing short skirts and, despite being an academically inclined avid student at school, breaking all his rules at home. She said, "My dad was a fire chief, but he also did electronics. He used to build wirelesses and TVs and things. I look back now and see exactly why I am the way I am. I was listening to all this weird noise as he was tuning things in, circuit boards going off. He bought me a tape recorder when I was 10 and said, 'You don't need a record player, you can take this and do things instead.'" I don't think he realized what he was doing. He just wanted someone, a boy, really, that he could share his interests with. When I grew old enough to challenge him as a woman, he saw me as a woman and that was it. Our relationship ended, and I was rejected. I wonder, did Cosey lose her parents because they were embarrassed to be associated with her or offended by her outrageousness? Or because they were afraid of her fearlessness? Cosey's investigation throughout her artistic career was largely an investigation into the self, to disrupt habit and habitus. And this disruption caused her parents such fear and scorn that they exiled her from the family, left her alone in silence, left Cosey out of their story as much as they could. Maybe your relationships are more important to you than your authenticity. And I get that, I really do. It's a special kind of loneliness that comes from having to choose between yourself and someone else and choosing you. Or to be rejected for being yourself. And I understand why some people will do anything to avoid that feeling. I know you. Us. Witches. And I know that some of us lose something by hiding out, and some of us lose something by showing out. On her deathbed, Cosey's mother told Cosey's sister not to tell Cosey that she was ill. She was worried the sight of Cosey might give her husband a heart attack. Cosey's mother tried to maintain an unrocked boat and lost her daughter. Cosey more than rocked the boat. She was a tidal wave sweeping across decorum, and this wave swept her mother out of her life. Cosey was angry at her mother, angry at her sister, but visiting her mother's grave, Cosey was struck by another anger. How much she and her mother and her sister had suffered at the hands of a domineering man. How much was lost to maintain her father's false sense of control. But Cosey was never alone and rarely in silence. Music was used in many of Cosey's performances in preference to spoken language, which she considered an obstacle to her visual presentations. She continued to explore the use of sound, scientifically, politically, commercially, and as a means of physical pleasure or pain. Cosey was the ultimate boundary pusher. She began her investigation into the overlap of art and sex by making collage cut-ups from dirty magazines. This kind of porno collage art has become somewhat of a mainstay in feminist art. The investigation into the male gaze as it relates to other women. Other women. But this wasn't enough for Cosey's investigative, curious, and creative mind. Often working naked in her performances, Cosey investigated self-image within the context of sex magazines and sex films, glamour modeling, and striptease from inside these spaces. She brought her experiences in these industries into her artwork, exploring how sex is perceived and transacted as commercial product. But she turned these tables constantly, mixing special effects makeup of bloody wounds into her performances, So someone or some member of the press showing up at a Coombe Collective gig because they heard there would be nudity was instead confronted with body horror. One of Coombe's slogans was, "We guarantee disappointment." She placed conventional beauty in a situation where it was subjected to simulated mutilation in front of a live audience, visually contrasting, highlighting, and questioning the notion of what is presentable as beauty. What is sexy? One night might find her go-go dancing under the synonym scarlet in a seedy strip club. Then the next night her nudity is given different context when she appears naked in a gallery setting. For Cosey, both were performance art. She insisted on occupying multiple roles in her works: artist, model, musician, her own self. A few weeks ago, Risa quoted Leonora Carrington saying, "I warn you, I refuse to be an object." And this is something that could have come from Cosey, investigating objectification through objectification while simultaneously refusing to be an object. Her performance art, or the term she prefers, art action, also tackles the body in another way, sometimes involving real blood, piss, cum, vomit. For Cosey, the beauty is in the whole package. I am listening to her music as I write, disappearing in and out of consciousness with Cosey's reverb-drenched, largely unintelligible, but somehow also manifesto-like spoken-word vocals as my guide, riding the fader from background to foreground, background to foreground. Layers of sound, word, and emotion blend into music and noise, both comforting and disquieting. Sometimes minimalist, slow, single notes drip from what sounds like a church organ in outer space or a guitar at the bottom of a cave. Sometimes beats stack on top of synth stabs like lemon layer cake, sweet and sour. Her song Ritual Awakening feels like just that. A ritual awakening of some part of us that only Cosey's oral alchemy can rouse. Cosey and her music are subversive, confrontational. She's a pioneer, breaking new ground, creating paths. As a founding member of Throbbing Gristle, Cosey is credited with inventing industrial music. She had taken piano lessons from age 11, but chose the guitar as her primary instrument in Throbbing Gristle because of her unfamiliarity with it. It was a wholly new instrument for her, so she was able and allowed to experiment outside the confines of training and tradition. Soon she became interested in synthesizers, building them with notions of audio and physical disruption, machines to shift the ions in the air. Her EP Time to Tell was originally released by the zine Flow Motion in 1983 as a cassette and booklet, and only got a proper release on vinyl in 2018, the version twirling on my turntable now. As Cosey's legacy continues to grow, Cosey begins to get her due. She performed Ritual Awakening Part 2, face painted white with black sigils in a triangle of votives and a pyramid of string, kneeling in front of a small homemade altar on the floor in 1987, saying she hopes her work will steer you into uneasiness, and from there will begin the process of thinking. More recently, she was tasked with creating a soundtrack for a film about synth proto-pioneer Delia Derbyshire. Delia is probably most famous for her composition of the iconic Doctor Who theme song. Delia had to record hundreds of electrical beeps onto tape, adjust the pitch of each individual note, and then splice them all together to create a bass line or melody. The end result was music with an otherworldly and mysterious quality. Delia helped create a musical style we still associate with science fiction today. When I was very young, TV Ontario played Doctor Who right after Today's Special, a children's show about a mannequin who comes to life. So it was a race to the TV to turn the channel before the happy puppets faded into the terrifying cry of "Ooh!" came screaming out of the television, careening my heart into my throat. This piece of Delia's music terrifies me, but in a different way than Cosey's does. The Doctor Who theme song gave me visceral, skin-crawling fear, while Cosey's music scares me because it wants me to confront something within myself. A ritual awakening. Cosey's work with Delia's sounds led her to write an accompanying book, Resistors, in which Cosey finds kinship with Delia, not just because of their work with synthesizers to create emotions, but also because they were both, as Cosey puts it, defiant women with our own unconventional attitude toward life. Untamable spirits, progressive thinkers living within the inherent societal constraints of our times, but finding our own ways to circumvent them in our pursuit of selfdom. We pushed against restrictions, compelled by visions of differing kinds, and a deep sense of needing to rid ourselves of the unease we felt at being in the places we were expected to accept without question, undaunted by both feeling and being treated as outsiders, while embracing and staying true to the outsider in us. When undermined by societal pressures to accept our place and play our part, Cosey continues, we found ways to traverse the world on our own terms. Despite facing vilification, rejection, and worse for our views, lifestyle, and world, our recordings played a vital role in sustaining us, making our lives meaningful, making us feel whole, ourselves. The processes adopted being the root to a sense of freedom. We weren't afraid to record our presence in the world through our actions and to create something to share. I want you to know that Cosey based her memoir, Art, Sex, Music, on diaries she had been keeping her whole life. And if I have one regret, it's that I don't have a resource like this for myself. So I encourage you, and I encourage you to encourage your kids to keep a journal, to record our presence in the world. I also want you to know that in the Genesis P-Orridge episode, I made a big deal about how Jen had lived on the fringes, how Jen had never had a straight job, but guess what? Cosey did. Cosey lived in those squats with Genesis while still working full-time at a JOB job and working devotedly on Coombe Project, dancing, modeling, and taking care of Jen and the house. And I can't help but think of Lady Frida Harris, who both designed and funded what would be known as Aleister Crowley's tarot deck. And I think of my grandmother, who did seamstress work to fund law school for her husband. How many unnamed women worked harder than the famous men whose projects they facilitated? And while Cosey has scoffed at her perceived prudishness of women's lib, she is by our definitions most certainly a feminist, and most definitely a witch. She is studious, but also inventive, and brings an unapologetically female perspective to every work, including her exploration of the occult. Here she rejects a dogmatic approach and instead focuses on her intuition. She wrote, "I didn't base my approach to life or art on Burroughs, Manson, or Crowley. Interesting as they were, their methods seemed more about them, and tailored to suit their male lifestyles. My interest in Manson was about how unchallenged manipulation and control within an isolated group could lead to extreme and dangerous actions and damaging behavior. Crowley and the occult interested me a great deal, but some of our peers regarded it as a prerequisite for being industrial, along with owning a collection of macabre books and objects and using the kudos and mystery they provided to shock. I wasn't into following someone else's formula. Knowing oneself was a meaningful, positive goal in life that made total sense to me, and living my life through intuitive experience was my way toward that end. I was hungry for the experience itself. It provided material for further works and challenged my personal boundaries, which in turn made me more open to taking things further, all in the pursuit of finding and becoming me. Belief in the power of myself increased. I was conquering my fears, dismissive of others' expectations, and growing in strength of will, and consequently I considered myself an independent entity, no longer willing to be tied to or submissive to others' whims and folly. An interview in an online magazine that focuses on electronic beats, another area where Cosey can take her place among pioneers, turns from music to magic. Occultism is a private issue, she says, but I will say that my interest in occultism lies in the broadest sense of the concept. Certainly I've embraced spirituality, and I feel that a deep sense of self is essential to fulfill one's potential. This also goes for maintaining a connection to a seemingly hidden dimension that is possibly out of reach, if one conforms to restricted notions and established modes of thought, expression, and ways of living and communication. Having experienced my own death and resurrection after undergoing a heart procedure some years ago, as well as the loss of so many dear and very spiritual friends, my thoughts on the subject now have shifted somewhat. When we are vital, organic life forms, our potential for being is in our hands, and it is determined by our self. Whether one chooses to achieve that through occultism or other practices is a personal choice. But in my mind, occultism, or other channels such as organized religion, Scientology, and so on, act as facilitators. Practices alone do not provide any given right of access to our deep, inner self. I love that Cosey rejects the prerequisites. She said, "We didn't see why you needed a certificate to be an artist anyway. My mind was focused on the fact that I could be who I wanted to be as an individual. I didn't belong to anyone. Everyone has potential, you just have to acknowledge it and act on it." That's what Coombe was all about. That's what TG is all about, and that's what I've always been about. She has this feeling I relate to, and maybe you do too, that Crowley and other occult mainstays are interesting, but that their work is about them. And Cosey knew she needed to make work about herself in order to conquer fears, to grow in strength of will, to follow and meet her own deep inner self, in order to not belong to anyone. This is an invitation, I feel, in this story for all women and objectified bodies to use noise, sex, magic, art, music, any and all tools you have at your disposal to come toward vitality. Tomorrow is Halloween, and we're supposed to be scared, to render our fears absurd, abstract, and get a thrill and chill confronting the darkness with laughter and merriment. And maybe that's a spirit we can bring to all our worries. To embody our beliefs and our investigations. To be fearless and creative in the construction of our lives. Cosey said, "Life is the true artistic media. A denial of life and the world about us is a denial of one's self and one's perception. You must open yourself fully to experiences which present themselves." I chose the controversial. This saw when, dear witches, find a way to traverse the world on your own terms. Because Cosey made a new family. She and Chris Carter, another founding member of Throbbing Gristle, are still married, still together, still making art and music together, and they have a son, Nick, who's now grown and plays gigs with his parents. She calls him the best Chris and Cosey collaboration that ever was. See, sometimes, when we traverse the world on our own terms, we find people on that path who love us for exactly who we are. The beauty in the whole package. Our potential for being is in our hands.
Heck yeah.
Hi, Risa.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for taking me on this sonic, political, badass art journey. I
Yeah,
really, really fucking loved it.
thank you for coming with me. Cosey can be a bit scary. It'll be kind of difficult for me to sift through photos of her work to create an Instagram post that won't immediately be taken down.
Yeah, right.
And bless her for it.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. I want to know what you think about that art practice as a feminist practice of using sexuality, like using our own sexuality, cutting up pornography, using our own nudity, like playing with object and objectified. How do you think about that?
I think that Cosey's manner of doing it is very, very, very interesting to me. Because like we talked about, she was making these like porno mag cut-ups, but that wasn't good enough for her. She wanted to be in the pictures that she would then be cutting up to make her art. And she worked as if any other, sex industry model would work. And so she would have to go and find these magazines after the
Right.
fact. And she didn't necessarily know where the pictures were going. So it was almost like this was like an extra, practice. And the art was to go and find these things that had been made of her. I think it's
Wild.
yeah, right. And this
Wild.
was
Yeah.
this was happening in like 1969 through like 1975.
What a leap, like to feed yourself into the objectification. Like, but
Yeah,
it's not pretend, or it's not a practice. She didn't do the photos with a friend or an art photographer and then cut them up. Like, she went all the way through.
yeah. I mean, she did do that too, for sure.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, she talks about this one sex industry photographer, Zabo, who, according to her, was like the only one that she loved, the only one that she felt respected by, the only one that she felt any kind of sense of collaboration, any sense of anything other than just being a body.
Right.
I mean, this was integral to her and her journey. But I mean, for me, I've always been kind of more modest. Like nudity has not, I'm not really an exhibitionist like that. I don't have any problem with other people's nudity. I'm not like prudish, but it's not something that I've even been compelled to investigate in any, way other than
Yeah.
personal. But I think I have missed out on a lot of personal information in
Do
having this
you?
modesty. Yeah, I think that, again, I mean, I don't want to talk about this in terms of my personal life, like my slut phase, which I did have, and I encourage, as long as people are being safe and respectful and consensual. I want you to go out and have mad wild sex and all those wonderful things. But it was never something that was the focus for me, maybe, is the thing. Like, I would never go out and try to pick up. Like, I would go out dancing because I wanted to dance,
Mm.
or I would go to the concert because I wanted to see the band. There's no.
Yeah, totally. I like it's interesting to think about like times when I chose to like present in a sexualized way. They're like pretty few and far between. It wasn't something, I mean, I have, but it always felt like a character. Like the time I remember feeling that power, that like sexuality power the most, was like backstage at a show in high school where I think I was playing like a prostitute or something, which is weird to have high school girls go to the boys' school to play like the three speaking roles for women, and one of them is a prostitute. It's weird. It's a weird thing that happens in the world. But backstage, I was like feeling myself, like I had this dress on and the makeup and the hair, and like it is a bit like being possessed. Like things were coming out of my mouth that like I like sexual references and stuff that I don't even think I really got,
Yeah.
like I was just like playing in my body in a way I'd never played before. I was being like adult sexy as like a game. And
Yes.
I think that's really fun. I remember Angela saying when we were starting our conversation in the Missing Samhain, the Missing Samhain episode,
Which you'll hear tomorrow, listeners. Hooray.
yeah, you'll hear the one that came about after the missing one, and you'll hear more of that story tomorrow. But I remember her saying at the beginning of that conversation that like dressing up in lingerie for herself at home and putting on music was like giving her a lot of power. Or maybe actually it was in a different conversation with Angela. It doesn't matter. You can edit my opinions out here. But yeah, I've been thinking about that since then, that like I can put on that sexuality and have that performative element without it being for an outside audience. And that might be a way for me to have some of the power without feeling the weird disruption in selfhood that happens for me, and that I think a lot of feminist theorists have written about, where it's like I'm object and I'm objectifying at the same time. And is there a space in between those two for agency? And Cosey's like cited as one of the people who finds that space for agency because she interacts with every step, I think.
Yes. And that's the thing with Cosey, is like you say, it's not pretend, but there was an element of irony to it. There is a bit of like a bit of what you think is happening is not what's happening. Especially, you know, she was there. She would be dancing in the strip club one night and performing nude in a gallery the next night. And it was the same body, different names, because she used a pseudonym when she was a stripper, but it was the same person, it was the same body, but the context being different changed the whole, everyone's understanding of that act, right? But to go back to what you were saying, this is something that you can do even without a partner. You don't need to put on your lingerie for a partner. This is something you can absolutely do in the mirror or without a mirror. And I would love that. I would love, like, you know, and I think that's part of why, you know, sexy is sort of one of the default costumes around Halloween time, you know, because it's like this excuse, this opportunity for a safe environment to dress like that. You know, you don't necessarily feel comfortable walking down the street in your fishnets and your boob top on a regular Friday night, but on Halloween there's the safety of not sticking out. You're blending into a sea of people in fishnets and fright wigs, and you know,
I love and admire the people who claim the radical safe space of wearing the sexy thing that draws the attention, draws the eyes, makes them visible, makes them a target on a regular night. Like, I think that there's so much power in that. I think that's part of why there's power in like young teenage girls who are like playing with their sexuality and are fucking fearless. They're just like, no, the world shouldn't be dangerous for me, no matter what I'm wearing. Stop it.
And they're right.
Your problem, not mine.
You know, I had a girlfriend who was like exploring clothing as almost like an art practice. You know, she would sort of dress up in different personalities and then like go out and see how. And we all do that in some way when we're putting on clothes in the morning. But for her, it was like a very conscious and intentional practice. And I was like, you need to try slut. And up until this point, she hadn't been scared at her project at all. And she was like, she's a modest person, you know, in dress. I was like, see how people treat you if you're wearing red lipstick and a short skirt and a low-cut top. That to me would be very interesting for you and for me as your friend who's hearing about this journey. And she was literally like, I'm not sure I can do it. Like, it was the one thing where she wasn't sure. And it's because it's not in this specific instance, it's not just, oh, what will people think of me? Or, you know, like, I don't want to, it's dangerous because that's the line and probably the truth that we've been fed, you know, is that women's sexuality is dangerous. This is, you know, we could trace this to witch hunts, you know, like women's sexuality is dangerous. for women and for society.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's something so interesting too about like the way that like playing with sexuality and then playing with sound and technology around sound as a form of amplification of the self. You know, that she was engaged in both those practices is super telling and super exciting. Like the idea of amplifying her own expression of self, her own like journey into herself, her own body. And I mean, you say that in that episode so poignantly that like where you quote her talking about, you know, there was this sense that like you had to be interested in Crowley and you had to be interested in fucking Manson's and you had to be interested in Huxley and like those things are interesting for sure. We've all gone down those paths, but she had this sense that those things were about those men and she needed to find a practice that was about her own strangeness, that was about her own inner world, her own doors of perception, you know, her own tracing of the complexities of what could go wrong in control patterns, even when you're tapping into some of these like hidden or occulted knowledges, that those things can become very dangerous and very depowering for people in a group or whatever. She talks about the Mansons, but I think that's so interesting that like to the idea of like following our own journey, whether that's through sexuality or getting loud or like performing versions of ourselves that are rehumanizing for us in whatever way that looks like, that is a fundamental part of our practice, of our magic, you know.
Yeah.
That's the strange, interesting stuff that I'm craving, that I've been missing, you know, like I want to see people's inner worlds.
Yeah. And that's why I claim the term witch, but I don't call myself an occultist. Because like I've obviously, you know, through this project and before, like I've done a lot of reading and I read and I read and I read and I study and I look at what other people have done and where they find, you know, and we're inspired by other people's workings every single day. But it's usually the stuff that comes from nowhere, everywhere, the cosmos,
Yeah.
that really like feels magical to me.
Yes.
You know, when I'm going through a spell that someone has written, it feels magical. But when I'm doing a spell of my own creation, it feels more magical.
Totally. I feel the same way. I was on that Around Grandfather Fire podcast this week and had such a lovely conversation with those folks. And they were asking me about my own spiritual path. And I sort of had to think out loud about it for a bit, coming from artistic practice and then improvised, you know, solitary work. And, you know, I kind of told the whole story, but a big piece of telling that story is being like, a lot of this is just really private.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I read and explore and like telling the stories and playing with different other people's practices, but I really related to that in what Cosey said, that finding a spirituality or whatever you want to call it has to be incredibly personal and private and play, you know, something that you find through the weirdness of your own body, the weirdness of your own strange synapses, you know, that's the real juicy shit.
Risa, can you tell your listeners before we spiral at your listeners?
They're
yours
divided.
now.
They're into two camps.
Yeah.
They're gonna do a dance battle. Yours and mine.
Can you tell our listeners and our coven mates and our friends, hey gorgeous, how getting loud impacted or dare I say saved your life?
Yes, the story that I tell in the book, and I'll tell a different version of it every time, I guess, but I was singing. I was always singing. I would walk to and from school making up songs, but it was so quiet. I didn't realize how quiet it was, honestly. I started, in early grad school, I started putting on live shows and, doing sound checks and working with musicians all the time. And then I started, sometimes I would be in a group of people and we'd be jamming or whatever. And only then did I realize, like, I'm basically whispering all the time. I was listening to Karen Kilgariff's live at the Bootleg, and she says she wrote a song that she didn't realize she couldn't sing because she wrote it whispering. And then when it came time to play it, she realized it was too high for her to actually sing. And I think that was a lot of my experience. I thought my voice was like really, really high because I was only ever kind of squeak whispering. And I was in a long relationship with a brilliant and kind person that ended up being kind of a prison for me. That wasn't really anybody's fault, but yeah, and part of that has a lot to do with technology, like that we were both so deep into thinking about open source software and technology, and our house was full of computers, and it felt like that hum of the computers was a part of the migraines and of the ideas that went into my thesis at the time and stuff. But there reached a point where I had to leave, and I tried to leave a couple times and it didn't work. And then one day I left and just walked out the door with very, very few things and went to a friend's house and kind of puked and cried and fell apart. And then I think it was the next day I went to your house, and you and I would get together and sing music and stuff. And I think I was mostly quiet, but I was having fun and like learning from you. But it was really like leaning, like I couldn't talk about what had happened because it was too complicated to talk about why I had to leave a good person. Like that was just still something that's like I could write 100 pages about and still not really understand it. But you were like, do you want to talk or do you just want to sing some shit? So we just sang some shit, and it was a very physical feeling. In my mind, it's all in one moment, in one time of playing music, but it might have been spread out, but just of feeling, and it was leaning up against your voice because Amy has a huge, beautiful, and very uplifting voice. There's space for other people in Amy's noise, which is a real gift. Because she's the mean auntie, right? It's like she doesn't have a lot of space for you to fuck around and like feel sorry for yourself, but you can. But she'd rather you just fucking sing or something. I don't know. I'm trying to paraphrase a vibe. It's not. But there's something about that increasingly made space. Like my lungs could take in more air. I could yell louder. I had made a decision that I knew was right. And so those two things happened at the same time, where suddenly it felt like my lungs grew double the size. Like the bottom constraint in my lungs just broke open, and I could take a bigger breath, and something in my throat broke open in trying to just sing loud enough with you. And I was crying a little bit, and I was out and I was free, and my voice became like, a lot louder, like 4 times louder. And I could find, where my voice actually fit against and within yours and the guitars and ukuleles and stuff. And I just suddenly took up more space. And people always say, like, let yourself take up space, and you don't know what that means until you break through something that has been like lacing you in and you didn't even know it was there. And then you take up more space and you breathe differently and you're louder and you're like, fuck, everybody take up more space. But you didn't know the meaning of the words until it happened in your body. I hope that's the story you wanted me to tell when you asked that question.
Yeah, because I mean, again, I think this we can tie it all up right now by saying, like, if you give yourself a safe space to be loud and or sexy, loud and sexy, let's go with loud and sexy. You can, like Cosey, discover things that you didn't know about yourself, or open up your lungs, symbolically or literally. You can open up parts of you that you were either very quiet and so you couldn't really hear them, or that you didn't know existed.
And I want to add, like, if you have felt constrained by a performative idea of sexy, or like if you felt like your gender identity had to be performed in a traditional femme sense, you can find those other noises for yourself, those other dimensions for yourself, possibly by playing in the other direction. So you don't have to play more sexy, you could play more mask. Like you could play more monster. You could, like you could play. There's a Twitter bot that does like the gender for today is the smell of grandma's pie. Or like you can play at the other reaches of that body. Like you can get go to a thrift store and get a giant men's coat. Like what am I thinking of? Like a like a Dick Tracy fucking...
Like a trench coat?
Trench, yeah. That was something that I did for a while. I had this giant, oversized, over-shouldered trench coat and this stupid, big felt hat, And people would laugh. My friends would laugh when I went to shows like that. But it was part for me of being like, some expressions of sexuality gave me power, but some expressions of fuck you to sexuality gave me power. So I want to add that.
Yes. Yes, let's put it all in the cauldron and play and go bobbing for apples of our own sense of self.
I love that. Yeah. Face first.
Face first, loud and sexy, and blessed fucking be.
And blessed.
You must be a witch.
The Missing Witches podcast is created by Risa Dickens and Amy Torok, with insight and support from the Coven at patreon.com/missingwitches. Amy and Risa are the co-authors of Missing Witches, Reclaiming True Histories of Feminist Magic, which is available now wherever you get your books or audiobooks, and of New Moon Magic, 13 anti-capitalist tools for resistance and re-enchantment, coming fall 2023.